in fact, that in a number of cases we cannot recognize and therefore do not know the wild parent stocks of the plants which have been longest cultivated in our flower and kitchen gardens. I just point this one out to say, notice how Darwin likes to often bring back word pictures that are germane specifically to something the reader would know. The kitchen garden, for example, right? To continue and finish now in comments from this first chapter, just the final lines. The final result is thus rendered infinitely complex. In some cases, the intercrossing of our aboriginal distinct species appears to have played an important part in the origin of our breeds. And then skipping down a few lines, the very last lines of chapter 1. Over all these causes of change, the accumulative action of selection, whether applied methodologically and quickly or unconsciously and slowly, but more efficiently, seems to have been the predominant power. We turn now to the second chapter, variation under nature. He says, variations in the natural world versus domesticated variation. The amount of difference between species must be greater than the amount of differences between varieties within species. He says Darwin distinguishes between what he calls dominant species, that is to say wide-scale existence, versus lesser-known species, more variations in the larger genre group. This refutes the idea, he argues, of a single creation by some deity or God. If God, for example, created each separate species, there would be no difference, he argues, in the amount of variety between larger, smaller groups of genre. By the way, obviously this idea, very hotly debated after the publication of Origin of Species. It'll be the larger group's variations, he says, which better struggle for survival. It will not be until 1942, with the German biologist Ernst Mayr, that we really have a modern definition of species. When we pick up and we read Origin of Species then, we're acutely aware of the historicity of this text, and there's a whole lot coming. It's very difficult, of course, today to read any of the texts in the Harvard Classics, certainly Origin of Species, without having some sense of this historicity, as I was just mentioning. In other words, there's a whole lot that will come after Origin of Species that will validate or invalidate Darwin's claims. A couple of lines really quickly from chapter 2, just again to give you a sense of the ways in which Darwin's language is quite remarkable. He says it this way, these facts are very perplexing, for they seem to show that this kind of variability is independent of the conditions of life. And then a few pages later, he will say this as well. He says, on the other hand, if we look at each species as a special act of creation, there is no apparent reason why more varieties should occur in a group having many species than in one having few. Darwin was acutely aware that he was dancing a fine line. There's always been a debate about whether Darwin was himself atheistic or not. He did take a degree, or wanted to take a degree in theology, no question. He was married to a woman who he loved deeply, who was a devout and believing Christian. And there's some historians that argue that Darwin was acutely aware of not wanting to wound sensibilities as close as even his own wife, and therefore danced a very, very fine line in Origin of Species, less so in Descent of Man, but certainly in Origin of Species. Let's move now to chapter 3, Struggle for Existence. Borrowing heavily from Malthus, a great writer that he had read before, that talked about the issues of overpopulation on the planet vis-a-vis the resources on the planet, we're going to get this notion of the survival of the fittest and the struggle for existence. He says in chapter 3, two things account for survival. First, he says there is the struggle for existence, and then there is what he calls natural selection, although other naturalists were talking about this as well. For example, we use the example of the beak of the woodpecker, the beak of the woodpecker, to talk about this. The most advantageous characteristics are preserved. They're passed on to offspring. How? He's not totally certain always, right? Nature will limit the number of possible inhabitants of the world. That is to say, we have competition. Thomas Malthus, I've already mentioned, and the notion of population growth and the survival of the fittest had been a reason why Darwin finally came to this notion of natural selection. He says the most important struggle is between members of the same species, right? And he says nature is both competitive as well as cooperative, and of course this led to a lot of readings, Herbert Spencer and others, who would make this comment of, well, what about humans? And again, the notion of social Darwinism, as it was sometimes referred to, will raise its head. Often in really ugly ways, the eugenics projects we're thinking of now in the 20th century, the way that the Nazis and others would play that game. Of course, Darwin didn't invent that kind of idea. We saw that idea as early as Plato in our study of the Republic, no question, the eugenics projects and all of that. All right, let's jump into chapter 3 really quickly and just enjoy a few lines from this one, from this chapter. There are a lot of, there's so much great prose in this third chapter. I really hope that if our conversations do anything for you, they lead you to pick up this book and read it on your own. It's quite fun reading. He says, but natural selection, as we shall hereafter see, is a power incessantly ready for action and is as immeasurably superior to man's feeble efforts as the works of nature are to those of art. A few lines later he says, nothing is easier than to admit in words the truth of the universal struggle for life, or more difficult, at least I have found it so, than constantly to bear this conclusion in mind. Yet, unless it be thoroughly ingrained in the mind, the whole economy of nature, with every fact on distribution, rarity, abundance, extinction, and variation, will be dimly seen or quite misunderstood. These lines sound in very similar ways, don't they, to the language of Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations, right? We behold the face of nature bright with gladness. Notice this bright with gladness line starts to make us think of the ways in which Darwin will often personify nature, in the same way that theologians had often personified God as somehow being anthropomorphic. We can go back to our Greek conversations, right? We behold the face of nature bright with gladness. We often see superabundance of food. We do not see as we forget that the birds which we are idly singing round us mostly live on insects or seeds and are thus constantly destroying life. Or we forget how largely these songsters or their eggs or their nestlings are destroyed by birds and beasts of prey. We do not always bear in mind that though food may be now superabundant, it is not so at all seasons of each reoccurring year. In other words, Darwin says you can romanticize nature as being this amazingly beautiful, kind of peaceful place, and forget the fact that nature is often very violent in the fact that some die and some survive. For Darwin, obviously, natural selection will be linked to this idea. He says a few lines later, hence, as more individuals are produced that can possibly survive, there must in every case be a struggle for existence, either one individual with another of the same species, or with the individuals of distinct species, or with the physical conditions of life. It's the doctrine of Malthus applied with manifold force to the whole animal and vegetable kingdoms. This is, of course, a powerful moment early on in the Origin of Species text. Finally, one other passage I'll read just a few pages later in the third chapter, the last lines of the third chapter. He said this way: when we reflect on this struggle, the struggle for existence in nature, we may console ourselves with the full belief that the war of nature is not incessant, that no fear is felt, that death is generally prompt, and that the vigorous, the healthy, and the happy survive and multiply. This evolutionary view of the progression of species, and again, this will become, after Darwin, far more prevalent in his language, is that nature is always progressing to something better and better. This will obviously be a huge debate by a whole nother group of individual thinkers who say, is it in fact the case that we are in fact evolving or devolving? And again, this is going to be the subject of huge debate for us, no question. Let's jump to chapter 4, which many have qualified as the most important chapter of the text. Natural selection of the survival of the fittest is what he calls it. If you don't read any other chapter of Origin of Species, usually this is the one that's recommended for you to read. Here, he argues that nature can select just like breeders can select. Now, the personification of nature will happen, no question, in this chapter. It's always going to be the question of whether this selection by nature, whatever that is, nature meaning, is intentional or unintentional. It's always been the subject of huge debate. Variations, notice he will say in chapter 4, lead to more offspring and therefore to winning, if you will. Darwin will often think, like Malthus, of the idea of competition like warfare. He says the wonder of nature, in many ways, this is like Adam Smith's invisible hand, will conduct its processes, right? Natural selection leads to sexual selection, therefore offspring, and therefore survival. For example, think about the ways that male birds will attract females, the coloring of the male birds, etc., right? Geography, of course, will matter, he says. Isolation is the key. It's all about competition in those kinds of circumstances. Divergences of character and gradual creation of new species leads to the origin of species, no question. He talks about branches of related species that either become extinct or will multiply and develop, evolve, although the word doesn't actually get used in the first edition of Origin of Species, over a period of tens of thousands of years. Now, of course, this is one of those things where Darwin wanted to argue that the earth is much older than theologians of his day had argued, roughly 6,000 years old. And for Darwin, you got to have a long time for the process of natural selection to occur to provide the species that we see all over the planet, right? Now, of course, he didn't get the dates on the amount of time right. I mean, you got to have a whole lot more time, modern biologists will argue today. Note, Darwin does not explain really how variations actually occur. That will happen in 1903 when genetic mutation will be discussed by Hugo de Vries and others as well. Darwin assumes, notice, that males, not females, pass on characteristics of offspring, and of course we know that he got that all wrong. And Darwin will struggle at times to personify nature the way theologians had personified God. And in the process, of course, often making it sound like he basically thought of nature the way theologians thought about God. We have a number of different passages here. Because this is such an important chapter, you'll notice, by the way, that I'm going to spend most of my time reading from these early chapters instead of the later chapters, just because the prose is quite brilliant. First of all, he says, this preservation of favorable individual differences and variations and the destruction of those which are injurious, I have called natural selection or the survival of the fittest. Variations, neither useful nor injurious, could not be affected by natural selection and would be left either a fluctuating element, as perhaps we see in certain polymorphic species, or would ultimately become fixed owing to the nature of the organism and the nature of the conditions. Several writers, he continues, have misapprehended or objected to the term natural selection. And then he jumps down a few lines later. He says, it's been said that I speak of natural selection as an active power, or deity, that is to say, God, right? But who objects to an author speaking of the attraction of gravity as ruling the movements of the planets? Everyone knows what is meant and what is implied by such metaphorical expressions, and they're almost necessary for brevity. So again, it's difficult to avoid personifying the word nature, but I mean by nature only the aggregate action and product of many natural laws, and by laws the sequence of events as ascertained by us. With a little familiarity with superficial objections will be forgotten. So, here we are, again, kind of recognizing Darwin wanting to talk about a process without personifying that process, and yet, of course, will in fact do often that very thing. And he says it out loud. He says, I'm aware I'm doing it. A few lines later, he says this, as man may produce, and certainly has produced, a great result by his methodological and unconscious means of selection, what may not natural selection affect? Man can act only on external and visible characters. Nature, if I may be allowed to personify the natural preservation or survival of the fittest, cares nothing for appearances, except insofar as they are useful to any being. She can act, notice again, nature being called the pronoun she, right? She can act on every internal organ, on every shade of constitutional difference, on the whole machinery of life. Man selects only for his own good, nature only for that of the being which she tends. And then a few lines later, at the conclusion of this paragraph, he says it this way, and consequently, how poor will be his results compared with those accumulated by nature during whole geographical periods. Can we wonder then that nature's productions should be far truer in character than man's productions? That they should be infinitely better adapted to the most complex conditions of life and should plainly bear the stamp of far higher workmanship. Let's put it in our notes now. Darwin's voice is almost always this kind of hope-filled voice when he's writing about the process that, he calls natural selection, right? Later, of course, termed evolution itself. A few pages later, Darwin has this to say, I am well aware that this doctrine of natural selection exemplified in the above imaginary instances is open to the same objections which were first argued against Sir Charles Lyell's noble views on the modern changes of the earth as illustrative of geology. Lyell, of course, in his geological observations had changed much of the landscape of the scientific world, and Darwin is saying, ostensibly, I am familiar that what I'm saying is going to be offensive and unsettling to any number of thinkers. The idea of his branches, by the way, will be referenced in some charts and that kind of thing that he produced as part of Origin of Species. Sometimes in your Harvard Classics volume you'll see this chart. Of course, you can find these charts now available easily online. You as students today, let's just say this out loud, you have a tremendous advantage in your study of a text like The Origin of Species. A, you can obviously get through it very quickly with help online, and as well, B, you can have all kind of guides that will give you some sense of where this theory has evolved, if we can use that term tongue-in-cheek, has evolved over time. The evolution of the evolutionary ideas clearly evolved since 1859 when they were presented. Well, that's chapter 4. Let's jump now to chapter 5, his laws of variation. He says variations do not occur by chance. They're somehow relative and related to environmental kinds of issues. These variations naturally selected over less beneficial variations, obviously. How might these variations occur, he asks? Well, the use and disuse of organs, that is to say the effects of habit. Variations, he says, in one organ may cause variations in a different organ of the same species, and they occur mostly in highly developed organs. Darwin didn't fully understand, of course, variation and heredity, and he certainly didn't understand what we would talk about today as genetics, but he already was gesturing towards it, and I think for that purpose we have to give him tremendous respect. Chapter 5, opening lines, he says, I have hitherto sometimes spoken as if the variation so common in multiform with organic beings under domestication, and in a lesser degree with those under nature, were due to chance. This, of course, is a wholly incorrect expression, but it serves to acknowledge plainly our ignorance of the cause of each particular variation. No question there will be huge debate from the publishing of Origin of Species about what stands behind these laws of variation, as he will talk about them. And as any number of theologians said, you have to have a lot of faith to believe in the ideas that are expressed in Origin of Species. A few pages later, he says it this way, no doubt, he says, it's very surprising a fact that characters should reappear after having been lost for many, probably for hundreds of generations. But when a breed has often been crossed only once by some other breed, the offspring occasionally show for many generations a tendency to revert in character to the foreign breed. Of course, here gesturing towards what later we will understand as the study, an important study of genetics. A few pages later, he says it this way, to admit this view is, it seems to me, to reject a real for an unreal, or at least for an unknown cause. It makes the works of a God mere mockery and deception. I would almost as soon believe with the old and ignorant cosmogenicists that fossil shells had never lived, but had been created in stone so as to mock the shells living on the seashore. Well, again, this is this notion of how profound our ignorance is. He then will begin his summary here in chapter 5 by saying, our ignorance of the laws of variations is profound. Not in one case of 100 can we pretend to assign any reason why this or that part is varied. Again, the admission of doubt, uncertainty. I like to point this out because I've often, even as I was preparing my comments here for Origin of Species, someone asked me, what's your next Harvard class? I had the Origin of Species, Darwin's Origin of Species. Oh yeah, man, and then they went off on Darwin as being this absolutist, certain thinker. That is to say, not a scientist, but moving towards scientism, that dogmatism that says we know what's right and whatever anybody else believes is absolutely wrong. And I said, if you pick up Darwin's Origin of Species and read it, you see a really humane man, a very curious mind, that is to say, the beautiful seeds of modern science. What modern science should always be, that recognition of the potentiality. I could be wrong. I think I'm right. Let's leave the door open to try and find out. Darwin didn't know anything about genetics. Now today we obviously do. I wonder in 1,000 years what they will say about the science that we, of course, consider so certain today. This is, of course, why we read great books. Because, of course, they provide us with a certain element of humility. And intellectual humility is the beginnings, of course, of all kinds of growth, as we have said before elsewhere. All right, let's keep going now. Moving on to chapter 6. difficulties of the theory, Darwin, as we said, in his fallibilist position, and chapter 7, his miscellaneous objections to the theory. So in other words, Darwin is willing to admit, okay, I recognize we got some serious problems here. Darwin will address primarily here 2 objections to the theory of natural selection. First, he points out as species have gradually descended from other species, why do separate, clearly defined species not exist or exist, right? Secondly, can natural selection really produce highly complex organs? And here he's ready to pick up what was always the mantra by creationists and those believing in the idea of creation, the human eye, or any animal's eye for that matter. How do you explain the construction of such an intricate organ as the eye? Natural selection requires that intermediate varieties become extinct, he argues. Question 2, he says, is more difficult, right? He talks about the flying squirrel's tail and the eye. And he says one of the things for sure is time. You got to have millions of years to be able to constitute the development through natural selection of an organ like the eye. It's hard to know what organ is useful or useless in the process of natural selection. He says the goal of natural selection is the improval of the species, the survival of the species. Again, you kind of got that almost like hopeful type of idea. The fallibilist Darwin, however, will admit that he can't explain why bat wings develop the way they do or why the eyeball is the way that it is. He suggests only principles of modification over time, right? Darwin, again, was this great believer in progress, which led again to this notion of social progress, which takes us not necessarily just backward or forwards, but also backwards to our study of Plato and the Republic. Let's just jump into a few lines here, the opening lines of chapter 6. Long before the reader has arrived at this part of my work, a crowd of difficulties will have occurred to him. Some of them are so serious that to this day I can hardly reflect on them without being in some degree staggered. It's an amazing admission, isn't it? But to the best of my judgment, the greater number are only apparent, and those that are real are not, I think, fatal to the theory. Notice he does call this idea of natural selection a theory. It is a scientific postulate. He's ready to admit the potentiality. I could be wrong. A few pages later, he